There's a song called With Each Borrowed Breath. It's a cover by the Clark family. And one of the verses reads like this. It says, "Every dawn, Lord, help me see. The hands of time move like a thief. The days are long, but the years are brief. So I will worship you. In the best and worst of times, all that life may take me through, with each borrowed breath you give, Jesus, I will worship you. And the days are long, but the years are brief. So I will worship you." And I imagine that you want to worship Christ this year. I imagine that you want 2024 to be a year that matters for the Lord, for eternity, for your family and friends. You want your life to count, and you don't want to count the days. You want to make the days count. No matter the circumstances, no matter the bummer dude kind of days, no matter the big changes in life, you want to worship Jesus with every breath that he gives. And I imagine that's how you feel, dear disciple of Jesus. I think that if you don't know Jesus, that is the kind of life you want to live, a life that counts. Well, Jesus can help you live a life that counts. Jesus can radically change your life so that no matter what 2024 brings your way, your life counts. And for those who know Jesus, it doesn't matter what happens to us in 2024. Jesus is with us. Life matters as we follow Christ because eternity matters. And eternity matters because God is real. And God is real, and we know this. Jesus came to earth. He died for our sins. He rose again. He forgave us. He lives in us. And Jesus' glory in us is simply waiting to be unleashed, shining through these frail human bodies. Knowing Jesus and following Jesus, letting the life and glory of Christ shine through me, that's how my life will count each and every day in 2024. And I imagine you want that. I know I want that. If you are 9 years old and you love Jesus, you want it. If you are 90 years old, which any takers of that today? Miss Reese? I don't believe that's true. Number one, a woman never gives away her age. If you're 90 years old and you love Jesus, I believe you want it. We want our lives to count for Christ no matter what. And I'm convinced that Timothy felt the same way. He was not perfect as a young servant of God, and things were hard for him. To be a faithful Christian, a committed disciple, it was not popular in Timothy's day to do that. And on top of that, to be a faithful Christian leader, a committed disciple maker, a preacher of the gospel, it landed people in prison, on trial, under execution. Paul, who wrote this letter, was about to die because he followed Christ. Now, Paul knew that Timothy had a genuine faith. He left Timothy in Ephesus because of that, to help the church there. He trusted Timothy to do the work of the ministry and wrote this final letter to stir him up in the Lord. He might have been fearful of doing what God called him to do. Yet he was confident in Timothy, but more so, he was confident in Timothy's Lord. And he wanted Timothy to share that confidence so he would share in the suffering and be faithful. See, he wanted Timothy to be faithful to the finish, as we saw in Sunday school. Paul was about to finish his own race. He had already stood trial, as I mentioned before, Nero, with crowds of Gentile people, Romans and others, listening to what Paul had to say in defense of himself and his actions for Christ. And he expected to stand trial again. In fact, he expected to die soon. He knew he would soon depart from this life. So he wanted to see Timothy ASAP. He urged Timothy to come see him in prison. These are the last recorded words of Paul. And whether Timothy made it to see him or not, we have Paul's last words written here. So my approach is this today. Last words for the first of the year. Last words for the first of the year. Do you want to make this year count? You can. Do you want Emmanuel Baptist Church to thrive for Christ's sake? We can. But in order to make this year count, we need to grasp something very fairly simple, something that typically the end of one's life brings into focus. And this is something that is all over the last words of Paul to his son in the faith, Timothy. What is it? What do we need to grasp? People. People. We need to grow to understand people. we need to remember, we need to embrace, we need to wisely interact with the reality that thriving as a church and making my life, making your life count as an individual Christian, it all boils down to my relationships with people. The last words of Paul and these words of 2 Timothy 4, verses 9 through 22, they have to do, we read them earlier, I'm not going to reread them, but they have to do with over 20 named individuals and multitudes of unnamed individuals. His last words to Timothy had to do with people. His last words had to do with people in the Lord, people in relation to the gospel of Jesus Christ, people in relation to Paul and his ministry. And so thriving as a church and living a life that counts, it has everything to do with people. We need to understand people. We need to understand them. We need to see that relationships matter. We need to grasp that discipleship and mentoring relationships matter for Christians. And we need to believe that the Lord works through people, that people need people. We need to understand what people are like. See, people have the tendency of being all over the board. Faithful and unfaithful. Committed and uncommitted. Solid and flaky. Submitted and stiff-necked. Trustworthy and unreliable. Godly and worldly. Restored and fallen, and everything in between. We see all of that in this text. Some pastors jest that ministry wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't for the people. And they say this because people are people. Yet the truth is, hear me, gospel ministry would not be gospel ministry without people. And it would do every pastor well to remember that. Church life would not be church life without people. Discipleship would not be discipleship without people. Church growth doesn't happen without what? People. Making disciples, it doesn't happen without people. Church ministry doesn't happen without people. And the thing is, people come in all spiritual shapes and sizes. You know? So the better we can understand and love people, the better we can trust that Christ is faithful, the better we can serve Him together. Make sense? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to walk through Paul's last words to Timothy and grab some catchphrases to help us with people as we begin the first of the year serving Jesus. Who likes catchphrases? Get your crochet needles ready. I have 5 catchphrases today to apply Paul's words to Timothy to our lives as disciples. I'm only going to give you 3 of them this morning. You'll have to come back for the other 2 tonight. Number 1, and you can take notes if you have your bulletin there. Number 1, I need you. I need you. This is what Paul told Timothy. Paul told Timothy to come as soon as possible. Come as soon as possible. We saw this in verses 9 to 13 and saw it again in verses 20 and 21. Verse 9, he said, do thy diligence to come shortly unto me. Do everything you can to get here as soon as possible. Verse 21, do thy diligence to come before winter. See, Paul was in prison. He was about to die, and he wanted to see Timothy one last time. He wanted Timothy to come as quickly as he could. And he wanted him to get to Rome before winter because it was nearly impossible to travel during that season in that time of the world. Imagine driving through extreme winter weather is bad enough as it is, but imagine doing that on a horse or by foot. See, if Timothy waited, it would be too late. He wouldn't be able to come if he waited till winter. He'd be stuck and Paul would be gone. No final goodbyes in person. And obviously Paul wanted that last goodbye in person. I mean, Timothy was Paul's son in the faith. Timothy was Paul's reproduction, if you will. Paul was a follower of the Lord, yes? He taught others to follow the Lord, right? He was a disciple who made disciples. Well, the disciple who was most like a son to him was Timothy. He trusted Timothy. Timothy ministered like Paul. Timothy loved like Paul. Timothy was not a carbon copy of Paul. And the people that Timothy ministered to might have thanked God for that a time or two. Who knows? But he was close enough. Timothy learned the gospel depths from Paul. He learned how to minister the gospel from Paul. He knew everything about Paul's life and service to Jesus and was seeking to continue in the same way that Paul had gone. Now, who else would Paul trust to pick up the baton when he was gone? And who else could Paul pass the torch to but Timothy? Who else could manage Paul's network of friends, disciples, churches, and even enemies for the sake of the gospel but Timothy? You think about Elisha and Elijah in the Old Testament. When Elijah was whisked off to heaven, fiery chariot and the horses, Elisha was appointed in his place. And when he was appointed in his place, that came with all the good and all the bad of what that meant as a prophet of God in Israel. A nation ruled by a bad king. And Timothy's Elijah was about to depart to heaven. And he would face all the good and bad of being appointed in Paul's place as a gospel preacher. One pastor illustrated this way. If you can imagine a coach retiring, a long-term coach retiring from coaching a football team like the Bulldogs or the Crimson Tide or whatever, and briefing the incoming coach on the team. The incoming coach inheriting the team, inheriting the assistant coaches, inheriting the offensive coordinator, the defensive coordinator, or whatever it is, inheriting him. And the retiring coach, he briefs the incoming coach on the team, the good, the bad, and the ugly. He communicates everything. The incoming coach needs to know as much as possible to have a shot to be able to coach that team well and coach them to success. See, that's what Paul was doing here. Paul needed to communicate to Timothy about all these different people, and he did so in writing. And Timothy needed to know the ins and outs of these friends and foes of Paul and his ministry. See, Paul wanted to say more than just goodbye. The work that Jesus did in people through Paul would continue past his death, and Timothy would carry it forward. So this was more than just, I need you, because I want to say goodbye in person one last time. This was an I need you because I need to get you ready to take my place. I need you, and I need you right now. See, even in prison, Paul was still very active in gospel ministry, still leading fellow laborers to strengthen churches, sending guys to other cities and other churches, still proclaiming the gospel faithfully, and he needed Timothy in Rome at a critical time. Why? Well, he had lost helpers in Rome. He needed Timothy because people he depended on were gone. Look at verse 10. We saw that Demas forsook Paul. Demas had sincerely helped Paul in the past. He called him a fellow laborer. You can see Colossians chapter 4, verses 14 and 15. Or Philemon chapter 1, verse 24. Well, Philemon only has one chapter, but verse 24. Demas had helped him. Paul called him a fellow laborer, but while Paul was in prison, Demas left him. He abandoned him at a critical time. And why did he do that when he was needed? Well, he loved this present world. Demas in love with the world and not in love with the pain and suffering of faithfully following Christ like Paul. He didn't love that. He loved the world. He left Paul when Paul needed him the most. Demas didn't want to be the bad guy with Paul. Paul was arrested. He was condemned. He would be executed for Jesus. Demas didn't want that. He wanted the world. He wanted to save his life. He wanted to save his neck. And so he left him when he needed him the most. However, the people that left Paul didn't all leave for bad reasons. The text communicates. They didn't all love the world. Verse 10 talks about Crescens going to Galatia and Titus to Dalmatia. Paul didn't give Timothy a reason that these guys went to those places. We assume it was for ministry or something like that or some other reason, but we don't have a reason. But they were gone. Verse 12, Paul sent Tychicus to Ephesus, and it's likely that he was the one. Remember, Timothy was probably still in Ephesus at this point, and so Timothy may have been the one who delivered this letter to Timothy and the church at Ephesus. Verse 20, you see, it mentions that man Erastus. He stayed at Corinth, and there's not given a reason why. Trophimus, Paul left Trophimus at Miletum because he was sick. He was a native of Ephesus, and he wanted to make it home to where Timothy was, but he was too ill to make it home. So you have different departures from Paul for unknown and known reasons. Some men left Paul, and there was no reason given. Paul sent others out to serve churches elsewhere. So Paul lost people in a time of need for both unknown reasons, others for ministry, others for health. Verse 11, only Luke remained with Paul. And not that that was a bad thing. I was listening to a sermon about this, and someone suggested that Some think by Paul saying only Luke is with me, he's implying, and you know how he can be. But that wasn't the case. That doesn't seem so. Luke was Paul's constant companion, his beloved physician. He was a careful historian who kept exact records, served at Paul's side in quiet ways. I mean, think about this. Here's a doctor, and he gave up his practice to travel with Paul and be there for him and minister to him quietly. But Paul needed more than just his beloved doctor. He needed ministry help. He needed Timothy. He had invested so much into Timothy's life when Timothy needed a spiritual father. Timothy's own dad wasn't a believer. And Paul raised Timothy up to be a spiritual man, a leader, and now he needed Timothy personally. And further, he needed Timothy to bring people and things. Verse 11, he told him to bring Mark with him. Verse 11, take Mark, bring him with thee, for he's profitable to me for the ministry. This is incredible because remember, this was John Mark who abandoned Paul and Barnabas years ago because things got too difficult. He went home to mommy. He left him. And this was the same Mark that Paul refused to bring along later when Barnabas said, hey, we should bring John Mark along. And Paul refused. He had no use for Barnabas, or not for Barnabas, but for Mark at that point because Mark had left them and Paul did not want to take him with him. He needed someone who would not leave him when he needed him. And the contention about that issue was so sharp between Paul and Barnabas that they themselves separated, and God still used that to advance the gospel. And yet, after all of that, Paul's in prison at the end of his life, and he's saying, hey, Timothy, bring Mark. He's profitable to me for the ministry. Something happened in John Mark's life that reoriented him to do what God wanted him to do, and he became profitable again. And Paul needed him. Verse 13, he had told Timothy to pick up his cloak from Carpus and Troas. As Timothy traveled from Ephesus to Rome, Troas would be en route, and Paul left his coat. You said, why didn't you just go down to Burlington or a coat factory or something? Well, you answered that yourself. All right? Typically, people would own one large outer garment and had a hole in the top of it that you stuck your head through, and you wore it like a big warm blanket, almost like a thick Snuggie, sort of a sleeping bag, poncho kind of a thing. And winter was coming, remember? Right? I mean, think about this. Think about the letter. Think about what's going on. Winter was coming. Paul wanted his cloak to be warm in prison through the winter time. Paul wanted his books and parchments. We saw that in verse 13. The books may be a reference not to books as we know them, hardbacks or paperbacks bound together, but rather papyrus scrolls. The word comes from a term used around Egypt regarding this papyrus. And parchments may be a reference to the Old Testament scriptures or other scriptures. And so Paul wanted to be warm, and he wanted to keep up his studies. And maybe he wanted to even give others access to his study materials. See, he desperately needed help from Timothy in some practical ways and some personal ways. He even needed help from John Mark, who had abandoned him and abused his trust long ago. John Mark was restored in Paul's mind at this point, so Paul was saying, I need you. Timothy, watch this. Timothy was still in need of Paul in his ministry. That's a big reason why Paul wrote this letter. And who of us don't need our spiritual mentors, even when we've been at it a while? He still needed Paul. But here's the deal. Paul needed Timothy and his life and ministry too. Isn't it nice to be needed? Doesn't it feel good for a faithful gospel servant to rely on you at critical times because he knows he can? He knows he can trust you, so he does. A pastor invests himself into a church building, the people up spiritually ministering to them, and he sees a variety of things happen. He sees some like Timothy blossom and grow, and they become invaluable to him in the ministry. Others prove trustworthy for a time, like John Mark or maybe even Demas, and then they leave. And breaks the pastor's heart. Leave maybe because they love the world. Others leave, there's no given reason. Others still are sent to other places to minister. Others get sick or aged and they cannot help as they would like. Others who fall away make things right. They come back around and are found to be faithful again. All of this happens in gospel ministry. All of it does. But it is a precious thing to be needed by a servant of the gospel at a critical time. And let me say this. This is the value of one-on-one discipleship. This is the value of making disciples. This is the value of training pastors and missionaries. It's the value of having a summer intern on into the new year. See, when we invest our lives into others to meet their spiritual needs, to raise them up to spiritual maturity, you know what we get? We enjoy a return when we need it the most. We disciple others not only because we are called to do it, but because God ministers to us through the faithful disciples we make. They need us, yes, but we need them. See, we want to train pastors because we need them. We want to train missionaries because we need them. And we will make disciples and spend countless hours loving and teaching people one-on-one and in group settings, small groups or disciple fellowships and corporate teaching and preaching. Why? Because we need faithful Christians. And to all the men and young men that I am personally discipling, listen, I need you. I need you. And when you sit down across the table or next to your own disciple in a coffee shop to love and to teach them, realize and tell them, I need you. To every faithful disciple who's been blessed by the Lord, who's been built up, who's been strengthened, equipped to minister, to every committed Christian who's faithfully serving God among Emmanuel Baptist Church, I need you. And Emmanuel Baptist Church says to you, I need you, and we need you right now. We must expect and understand the ups and downs of people as we serve the Lord at 3911. We have to understand that that is how it's going to be. People will leave us when we need them the most. Some will leave because they love this present world. They don't love Christ more than the pleasures of this life, so they'll leave him and his people. Others will leave for no apparent reason, and we might be left in the dark or maybe never truly know. Some will leave because we send them to other places to serve Jesus. They love Jesus and his church and his mission so much that we end up sending them to serve. Others will get sick or too ill to labor on with us, and we must love them and understand their situation, whether they're a shut-in or they are an aged person fighting disease, or they're an 83-year-old retired pastor caring for his wife, loving her and taking care of her. People are up and down for many different reasons. And that is why we need as many faithful Christians to be present, plugged in, and engaged here. If you are 8, 9, or 10 years old, if you're a teenager, if you're a young adult, don't go along with the crowd that says, hey, go find yourself, live for you, chase your dreams. No, don't do that. Choose to mature. Choose faithfulness. Choose to love Jesus. Choose to serve his church. If you are a faithful Christian young person, Emmanuel Baptist Church says to you, I need you. And every other age above youth, if you love Christ, if you love his church, and you want to be faithfully plugged in, serving Christ, making disciples, building a Christian life, a Christian home, a church, catchphrase number 1 for the first of the years for you, faithful disciple, I need you. Now's the time to be here and serve God with us. Let's move on to the second catchphrase, number 2. Watch out for bad guys. Watch out for bad guys. Our little Andrew calls them guys. And thanks to Bad Batch, probably. Anyways, to him, everyone is a guy. Construction workers are guys. Heroes, actual bad guys. Every guy is a guy. Sometimes they'll run to us at night saying, I squealed and guys. Point out the window. I want to protect my babies from bad guys. I want to watch out for guys. We need to pay attention and watch out for bad guys. Threats to the gospel ministry of Emmanuel Baptist Church. Paul instructed Timothy to watch out for a bad guy. In fact, Paul warned Timothy about Alexander the coppersmith, verse 14 and 15. He warned Timothy about Alexander the coppersmith. Why did he warn him of that man? Well, this metal worker was likely from Ephesus. It was possible that he was one of those craftsmen who made a lot of money from building and selling idols for people to worship. You can read about them in Acts chapter 19. When the gospel was making waves in Ephesus, it threatened their lucrative business because people didn't need their idols anymore. They had God. So those craftsmen, they stirred up a riot in the city, and it was huge, and it almost got deadly. It's plausible that Alexander's money-making and influence was at risk because of Paul and his ministry team, so he took action against Paul. Paul said in verse 14, Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil. He did me much evil. It means he hurt me a lot. And this wasn't so much physical hurt or bodily hurt. Others were doing that to Paul. It might have been more so psychological hurt, mental, spiritual. How so? End of verse 15. Paul said, he hath greatly withstood our words. See, Paul and his missionary team, they came to Ephesus and they preached the gospel there, and they taught the believers in that city how to live the Christian life, and they motivated the church to endure in the faith, and they trained pastors to lead that church. But here was this influential, this powerful and affluent man, and he fought against everything Paul said and led. And he hurt Paul. He did Paul much evil because he greatly opposed and resisted his teaching and leadership. He was a bad guy. He was evil because he made himself a personal enemy to the servant of Christ. He was an enemy of Christ's work in the church. Now, notice two comments Paul made about him to Timothy. Number one, Paul was not on a revenge trip against Alexander the coppersmith. If you follow Christ, you're not out to get anybody. Okay, number one, he told Paul that the Lord reward him according to his works. So Paul, although he was hurt by this great opponent, he left his judgment in the Lord's hands. He knew the Lord would hold him accountable. But that being said, number two, the second comment he made, he said, of whom be thou aware also. See, he wanted Timothy to pay attention, to watch out and be on guard of Alexander the coppersmith, to be aware he was not a friend of the gospel, but a foe. To be aware that he was an enemy of the gospel, he was an enemy of the Lord's work. See, Timothy needed to trust the Lord to judge Alexander, just like Paul was, yet Timothy needed to stay on guard against him. Catchphrase number two, watch out for bad guys. And listen, as long as the work of God moves forward among Emmanuel Baptist Church, we will have enemies and opponents. Listen, God is opening doors for us in this community with the gospel. And we can expect Satan to oppose us. We can expect enemies and opponents, and their opposition to us, the evil they cause, may not be primarily physical. Now, down the road in America, it may be physical hurt. Our brothers and sisters in Christ around the world are experiencing that. But often what happens in our land, the hurt they do to gospel servants in the Lord's churches is psychological. It's mental, it's spiritual. They resist, they withstand, they oppose the words and leadership of Christ's servants. See, Christ's servants preach the truth and they don't like it. A pastor leads a church according to the Bible and they talk bad about it to others. Disciples are made. The gospel is preached, but they are not on board. Rather, they seek to sow distrust of leadership and disunity among the church. If you are a bad guy in this sense and you are in opposition to the teaching of the Bible, and you are resisting the leadership that Emmanuel is getting from the Scriptures, are you ready to answer to Jesus for your actions? We all will answer to Jesus for what we do, good and bad. All of us. And you can hurt me, that's for sure. I'm human. I am not immune from being hurt or hurting because I'm a man. But I will learn to live with that. I will learn to play hurt. I will learn to keep fighting the good fight with a bloody nose, but I will also warn this church about you. Do you really want to be a bad guy here? Emmanuel Baptist Church, watch out for bad guys. Christian adults, mature disciples, growing disciples, listen to me. You want to obey Jesus Christ and His commands, right? You want to follow Him in the Scriptures. You want to be a disciple who makes disciples. You want to enjoy authentic Christian community, fellowship, ministry, camaraderie, brotherhood. If that is what you want as a disciple of Jesus Christ, I am asking you to be on guard of people who don't want what you want. And how do you know? They fight it. They don't agree with the teaching of God's Word and oppose the direction and destination this book plugs into our GPS as a church. Love them, pray for them, but beware of them. Young people, if there's a child or a teenager, we're on the cusp of seeing more people reached. We're sowing seeds in the community, in the high school, in the middle school, and we're in your high school, in your middle school, or wherever you are. And young people, if there's a child, there's a teenager, there's a young adult that comes and they seem to have an attitude and they want to be entertained, and they don't want to be discipled or hear the truth. I'm just warning you, watch out for them if they oppose the work of God. Love them, pray for them, be there as a friend, but don't let them ruin it for the rest of you. Children, teenagers, young adults, we have something special among Emmanuel Baptist Church. We are cultivating a multi-generational church here that expects children and teenagers and young adults to actually serve God and grow into healthy, thriving adults. That is awesome. Everything about it is awesome. And that means we love you. So watch out for young people, or adults for that matter, who fight that godly love. Catchphrase number 3, and we'll stop with this one, and we'll pick up the last 2 tonight at 6. The Lord stands by me, Paul said. The Lord stands by me. I cannot help but think of that song from the 60s, Stand By Me. Stand by me. You say, he did it. He did. Oh, stand by me. Stand by me. I like the sound of that. I don't know the background of the song or the writer of it, but stand by me. I like that. And in verses 17 and 18, Paul praised the Lord for standing by him. He praised the Lord for standing by him. Now, I'm going to come down here and give you a sense of this. Verses 16 through 18. So Paul mentions in verse 16, at my first answer, no man stood with me, but all men forsook me. I pray God it may not be laid to their charge. And I want you to picture Paul's experience, because he's in a prison cell. He wrote this letter. Timothy's reading it. And Paul had already gone on trial once. Things were heating up against Christians. Emperor Nero was persecuting Christians heavy persecution in the world. Paul was the front runner. He was the lead man. He was the spokesperson for Christianity. So they had him. They arrested him. He was there. He gave an answer. What does that mean? That first answer, that's the word apologia. It means a defense. Give testimony in a court trial. Here he is, and likely Emperor Nero is there on the judgment seat in a tribunal, a panel of judges, and there's other people there important in Rome, and there was an area for spectators to sit, to watch, and this would have been a highly dramatized court scene. If you can imagine back in the day, the court cases of the likes of O.J. Mayo and other things like that, or other recent impeachment trials. I mean, highly televised court scenes and all these things in pictures. That's what it was like for the Apostle Paul. And he stood there, here is Paul, and he was standing there to give an answer for himself. But Paul notes that there was someone who wasn't standing here and someone who was standing here. Because he says, at my first answer, no man stood with me. Nobody stood with him at that critical time in his life. Nobody in Rome. He said, they all forsook me. But watch his spirit. These people that knew Paul, that loved Paul, and yet when things were difficult, and they, for whatever reason, decided not to be there, to associate with that man, would have brought punishment on them, maybe even death. And perhaps in their weakness or their spiritual apathy, they're like, I don't want anything to do with that. And they left him. Paul's attitude toward them was not, come on, guys. Bunch of losers, bunch of wimps. That wasn't his attitude. You see what he said in verse 16? He said, I pray God that it may not be laid to their charge. Paul knew God's going to hold them accountable for how they live and act with the gospel under trying times. And though they did not stand by me in my defense, I pray that God doesn't lay it to their charge. They should have been. These people that were not here, they were the should have beens. And yet they were not. And Paul prayed that God wouldn't lay it to their charge. They were not standing there. But you know there was someone here who was. Because in verse 17 he said, notwithstanding the Lord stood by me. Why was Paul there? Because of the Lord. You know, back in Acts 27 when they were being tossed on the waves. Remember that story? The ship's being tossed everywhere, and the sailors are fighting the storm for days and days and days. And Paul goes down into the ship, and one night God or Jesus talks to him and says, hey, everything's going to be okay. I want you to preach of me in Rome. And Paul had confidence. The storm calmed and things, they made it. They survived. just like Jesus said, made it all the way to Rome. And just as Jesus said, Paul stood there on trial. And the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, who stood by him in the middle of a storm on the sea, stood by him when he was on trial. When everybody else forsook him, the Lord stood with him and strengthened him. Why? He strengthened him that the preaching, what is that? The heralding of the good news, the proclaiming of the gospel of Jesus Christ, his death for sin, his burial, his resurrection. The Lord strengthened him that the gospel by Paul's mouth would be fully known. In that setting with all those spectators and all those people on a world scene, the trial of the centuries, Paul was able because the Lord strengthened him to give the gospel clearly and fully so that all the Gentiles would hear it. To the very end, Jesus gave Paul the strength to do the mission he gave him of proclaiming the gospel. The Lord stood with him. And he felt this way, at least from that first trial. He said that I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. Whether that was literally, he was spared from being thrown to the lions and being eaten, being devoured and being consumed, or whether he's looking back at stories like Daniel in the Old Testament and rejoicing that God has delivered him, and what God did in that critical moment in Paul's life when Jesus was standing by him. It did something inside, because in verse 8, he said that the Lord shall deliver me from every evil work. It gave him the confidence that no matter what happened and no matter what came against him as he proclaimed the gospel, it gave Paul the confidence that the Lord would see him through, even if Nero wanted to kill him, and even if people rose up against him, and even if there were enemies of Christ in his churches, the Lord would deliver him. The Lord would see him through no matter what he had to face. And he would preserve me, Paul said. You saw it in verse 18. He would preserve me unto his heavenly kingdom. No matter what happens in my life, I'm going to be there. I'm going to heaven. The Lord stands by me. And I just want to ask you, our church, God is doing a work in here and among us to proclaim the gospel in days that are antagonistic to Christianity, antagonistic to the gospel, and in school environments, which evolution is taught as fact, and the boundary lines have been painted for religious organizations, and yet God is giving Emmanuel Baptist Church opportunities in your life and in my life to proclaim the gospel. He is going to use Emmanuel Baptist Church at this critical time. But I want to ask you, are you going to be like these over here who should have been there with Paul? But for whatever reason, they were not. They left him when it was time to stand for the gospel. Will you be a should have been? And if you are on the other side of this, don't resent the should have beens. You might be frustrated. You might be discouraged by people who have not been where they should be or done what they should do. And yet you need to follow the example of Paul and do what? Pray for them. That God would forgive them. That God would restore them. That God would not lay it to their charge. That God would strengthen them and bring them back. Because ultimately, our confidence and our hope as we stand for the gospel is the fact that God is with us. The Lord stands with his church and strengthens his church. And every step of the way, no matter what comes against Emmanuel Baptist Church in 2024, he stands with us and he will deliver us to his heavenly kingdom. And as Paul said, look at the end of verse 18. As Paul said, to whom be glory forever and ever. Jesus is going to get glory in this church. And all God's people said.